mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
In our first reading this morning, Paul is issuing a challenge to those in Corinth, those who call themselves followers of Jesus. You see, he wanted to test them, test us for that matter, to make sure that everyone understands the personal responsibilities and accountabilities to God that we must take upon ourselves when we decide to call ourselves Christians. And it isn't easy. He starts by saying that as people who call themselves Christian, we may appear to excel in everything that is required of us. We may even appear to excel in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness to follow Christ. And as such, we tend to be loved by others all around us. But Paul's question is, are we talking the talk, but failing to walk the walk? In other words, he is questioning the genuineness of our love by asking, how does our life as a Christian compare to the loving generosity of Jesus? For that is the gold standard by which we are all to be measured. Paul reminds us that Jesus could have chosen to have all kinds of riches throughout his earthly ministry if he'd wanted them. He could have lived in a palace. He could have had anything he wanted brought to him by servants who would have catered to his every need. But what did he do? Well, Paul tells us that for our sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Which means that if we follow Christ's example of generously sharing from our wealth so that others might simply have enough, then Paul assures us that we too will be spiritually enriched in faith and will grow closer to the holiness of God. But then he goes on to clarify that the gifts we give to help others out of the richness of our blessings should also be according to what we have and not according to what we don't have. In other words, we are asked to seek a balance between what we give out of our abundance and what we can genuinely afford to give to meet the needs of others. I remember one occasion in a previous parish a few years ago where we had a stewardship campaign underway, and people looked to me for guidance on how much I thought they should be giving. At the time of the offertory, when they were about to pass the plate around, I suggested that everybody exchange their wallets with the nearest neighbour and let them open it up and decide how much they thought that you could afford to donate to support the ministries and work of the church. Of course, nowadays, in the age of plastic, it would work equally well if we all shared the balance of our investments and savings accounts with our neighbours. It would be interesting, wouldn't it? Interesting experiment. Anyway, the rule of thumb is that our charitable givings, whether it be to the ministries of the church or to help provide food to the adults and children who are starving to death on the streets in Gaza, or to provide shelter to the homeless living on the streets of our own cities, the amount we give should be in balance with the amount that we've stored up for our own needs. Genuine followers of Christ should seek that balance, and involve a balance that involves making a sacrifice. Still not so much as Jesus sacrificed for us, but certainly enough that our offerings cause us to have to tighten our belts just a little. If the givings out of our abundance to help others barely make a dent in our income or savings, then perhaps Paul would say that we've failed his challenge to demonstrate that we truly understand and accept the responsibility and accountability to God by shaping our lives on the model of Jesus. And of course, it isn't just our finances that we are called to share, but also our faith, our time, our love, and our acceptance of others, so that through us walking the walk as well as talking the talk, others might come to build a relationship with Jesus and then build up their own spiritual treasures in heaven. You recall last week we heard Tawny, our Indigenous speaker, talk about the pain and suffering that had been inflicted upon herself and generations of others by the actions of colonial governments and church policies against our Indigenous people. Policies that sought not to embrace or to share, to accept or to love those who perhaps looked a little different, maybe lived their lives according to different traditions, but to inflict our ways upon them in order to assimilate them, or failing that, to genocidally destroy and remove them from our presence altogether. This mindset has been the way of dealing with the other for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. And it has caused untold grief and the death of so many men, women, and children throughout the world. Whether it be the Indigenous people of the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and many other regions around the world, or those who simply choose to worship God through different religious traditions, such as the divisions that have existed for generations and caused so much conflict between Jews and Muslims, Protestants and Catholics. Today, on Pride Sunday, we also remember the persecution and intolerance that we've seen demonstrated towards another group, the LGBTQS2+ community, who will be marching in their thousands through Toronto today. Yet, meanwhile, more than 70 countries still criminalise consensual same-sex relations, including 6 countries which still punish same-sex relations with the death penalty as their way of deterring or eradicating those who are different. In today's gospel passage, we are reminded that Jesus Christ came into the world to teach us the way to demonstrate our faith in God by accepting, embracing, and loving our neighbours as ourselves, no matter how different or unacceptable they may be to other segments of society. And he did it by talking the talk and walking the walk. Whether it be to break bread with sinners and tax collectors, to touch and heal people with leprosy, to take a stand, step forward, and defend a woman accused of adultery who was about to be stoned to death. Jesus said what to do and then did what he said, always with love, compassion, and forgiveness. For instance, despite the criticism Jesus had received from the religious leaders of the day for the things he had taught and done in the synagogues on the Sabbath, things like healing a crippled woman or healing a man with a withered hand in the synagogue, he immediately agreed to go with Jairus, who was one of the leaders of the synagogue, when he begged Jesus to heal his little girl who was close to death. That was a teaching moment in itself, because despite their rejection of him, without hesitation, Jesus was still willing to reach out in love, to embrace and to forgive, and then share his holy powers of healing with Jairus' daughter. Yet while on his way to the little girl and surrounded by a large crowd that were pressing in on him, Jesus suddenly felt some of that holiness, that holy power being momentarily drained from him by someone touching his cloak. Who touched my clothes? He asked. And then a woman came to him in fear and trembling to confess that it was her. This lady explained that she had been bleeding for 12 years. Her condition in society of that day, and in some societies even today, had rendered her ritually unclean. Not just for a week or a month, but indefinitely. She couldn't even enter the temple, which was the heart and soul of her religious community. She couldn't touch or be touched by anyone without rendering them to be unclean too. By the time she approached Jesus, she'd spent every penny she had and endured much under many physicians to find relief, but her bleeding had only worsened. The woman's very body, her femaleness, had become a source of isolation and disgrace in society. She was seen as different from others. So she'd been cast out as unwanted by society and left alone, lonely beyond description. And it might have remained that way if the woman in faith hadn't chosen to defy the religious rules of the day to pursue an encounter with Jesus. She knew she had no business going into that crowd. She would be accused of polluting the crowd with her presence. And she knew she was forbidden to touch any man, least of all Jesus. According to the religious rules, even touching his cloak would defile him. And yet her faith in the healing power of Jesus gave her the courage to touch him anyway. And what was Jesus' response to dealing with someone totally ostracized from society for being different and unclean? He invited her to share her story, to publicly tell about the 12 years of suffering that had been caused by the intolerant religious rules and the cruelty of those who despised and rejected her. But from Jesus, there was no rejection. There was no recrimination. There was just love and acceptance. As he said to her daughter, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Do you recognize the similarities between the intolerance and the rejection this poor lady had suffered with the intolerance and rejection that the gay community has endured for years, that the Catholic community has suffered in Northern Ireland, that indigenous communities throughout the world have suffered from those like us who've colonized and occupied their lands? We need to hear their stories. We need to get to know them, and we need to love and accept them as Jesus would. After her healing, Jesus and the crowd and Jairus continued towards the house where the young girl lay. But they were only met by people saying, "Your daughter's now dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But in another teaching moment, Jesus told the leader of the synagogue not to listen to what others were saying. Do not fear, only believe. A message that perhaps we should all choose to live by. That no matter what others may say to try and lead us away and deter us, trust in Jesus and continue with him for the rest of our journey. For he has things to reveal that are more than we could hope or imagine. When they arrived at Jairus' house, and despite the mocking laughter and the jeering of the crowd, Jesus took his disciples and the girl's mother and father into the house. And then he takes the dead girl's hand in his hand and tells her, "Little girl, get up." And she immediately got up, and he told them to give her something to eat. Do you notice that in both of these stories, Jesus took hold of what society considered to be unclean and unwanted. A menstruating woman and a dead body, so that he could show love, mercy, and acceptance to the lost children of God. We too must learn to do likewise if we wish to take upon ourselves the personal responsibilities and the accountabilities to God that are necessary when we decide to call ourselves what Paul would call genuine Christians.